Thank you, everybody, for joining tonight. I'm glad to see everybody has some interest in polling related to questions of clean water and climate resilience here in Massachusetts. And I know it's obviously a busy night. Every day during the week can be tough to squeeze this in, so we always appreciate you making the time. So, just to go quickly over for the plan tonight, I will introduce myself. My name is Stefan Geller. I'm the Senior Communications Manager for Charles River Watershed Association, and I'm joined here today with Ross Militich from HIT Strategies. He's a Senior Analyst. And for tonight, I'll basically just be giving a brief background on where we got this kind of polling from, and then Ross will dig more into all the details. And once he sort of goes through the different questions and responses, we'll open it up to question and answers. Also, quick shout out to all of our co-hosts for tonight's event, Mystic River Watershed Association, Neponset River Watershed Association. I got a lot of watershed associations. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Ipswich, North-South Rivers Watershed Associations, and Mass Rivers. So thank you guys also for co-hosting this event tonight. And so just a little bit of background. I participated in this polling cohort on behalf of CRWA. It was organized through Environmental Polling Consortium and in partnership with the Bar Foundation. And this was over four sessions, October through December. And we covered things, how to gather research questions, writing surveys, how to field surveys and different kind of methodology, and then looking at the data from those surveys and basically just all your kind of beginner intro on how to do surveys, the kind of correct way to go about it, and the effectiveness of different tools. And so by the end, each of us who participated in it were able to submit different questions. And Ross, as part of its strategies, they conducted a poll of about 1,000 Massachusetts residents, a little over. And those will be some of the results you will see tonight. So without further ado, I'll toss it over to you, Ross.
Thank you, Stefan. Pleased to meet you folks. As you said, Ross Militich, Senior Research Analyst here at HIT Strategies. We conducted a variety of polls for the Environmental Polling Consortium, but the one that concerns us tonight is this specific subset of our research that we conducted around sort of resilience, infrastructure, and other kinds of sort of water-related environmental concerns in the state of Massachusetts. Next slide, please. So we conducted the survey specifically among registered voters in Massachusetts, and we contacted a little over 1,000 of them with oversamples to specifically get to a statistically viable number of Black respondents and Latino respondents so that we could have a sense of sort of what their priorities were in the state. We were doing this research through an opt-in web panel, so it's a little bit different from the live phone call methodology that you see used in a lot of the campaigns. The trade-off for that is that we, get to ask a lot more questions within a relatively short time frame, and we get in contact with more people. But it's just a little bit of a different population that we're talking to compared to what campaigns would use for their research. We conducted this research basically the last 2 weeks in November. We were in the field for about 16 days from November 14th to the 30th, and the overall margin of error on this research is plus or minus about 4%. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that we always ask folks, really irrespective of what research we're doing, is give us the three most important issues facing your city, your state, your district, wherever it is that we happen to be polling. And it's not going to come as a shock to you, but inflation and the cost of living and affordable housing are by far and away the two most important issues in Massachusetts. This was very consistent with the polling that we had seen pretty much everywhere else around the country. Although in the last couple of months, we can see that healthcare, which was a tertiary issue for Black voters, Latino voters, and voters over the age of 50, would likely have risen in salience as increases in costs for healthcare have gone up as well. There's also some likelihood that immigration has increased in salience, but it's difficult to say without fresh polling. Next slide, please. We wanted to ask a similar kind of issue around some of the environmental issues that are facing the state. And, we wanted to get a better sense of what people were concerned about. And so we allowed folks to select their top two from this list of particular environmental issues, including climate change, unpredictable and extreme weather, air pollution, water pollution, PFAS and plastic pollution, habitat loss, deforestation, and biodiversity loss, or none of the above. Um, Within that list of particular issues, climate change is, the issue that stands head and shoulders above everything else among every subdemographic. It is, perceived to be the single most important environmental issue facing the state. And part of the reason for that is that it includes a goodly amount of the other issues that we have listed on this issue importance battery as well. So for instance, unpredictable and extreme weather is something that is very likely to fit within climate change as far as the public imagination is concerned. That being said, unpredictable and extreme weather is a secondary concern, and air pollution, water pollution, but really just pollution in general, are essentially the tertiary concern for voters across the state. Next slide, please. We asked a sort of more specific question on an issue importance battery of how important the voters in the state felt that it was for Massachusetts to have clean rivers. And this is not going to come as a surprise. This is sort of like a do you like ice cream question, or is it good to give ice cream to people? And the answer is that 99% of the voters in Massachusetts say yes, they think it is important for Massachusetts to have clean rivers. Um, when we are writing survey questions in the future, what will make this a more effective question is to put it in relation to other items or to offer some sort of trade-off, right? So is it important for Massachusetts to have clean rivers versus, paying some sort of fee, which will become relevant later on in this survey. Next slide, please. We asked some contrasting questions about the perceived seriousness of pollution in rivers in Massachusetts versus the perceived seriousness of problems in local rivers. And this is a dynamic that we see quite a lot, where voters perceive issues to be more serious or a more pressing concern when they're thinking about it on the more kind of like larger abstract scale. But once you get closer to home, issues tend to fall off in overall intensity, right? This is the same kind of dynamic that drives the instinct to be oppositional towards elected officials, but to generally like your local city council member, your mayor, people on your school board, things like that. And we see this dynamic play out in the state where over 72% of voters in Massachusetts believe that sewage pollution in Massachusetts rivers is either a very serious or a somewhat serious problem. We can see that there's a relatively significant lack of intensity here, right? So people are just not really all that certain. Either they think it's a somewhat serious problem or they think it's not a serious problem or not that serious of a problem. Few people are fairly definitive. And when we contrast that with some of the issues of sewage pollution in local rivers, we see that that intensity play itself out again, right? So there's a lot fewer people that believe it's a problem. Only 58% of respondents believe that sewage pollution in their local rivers is an issue, but with most of that difference flowing from the somewhat serious problem into not that serious of a problem. This just reflects a general kind of like lack of knowledge, but a sentiment that, this is not really an issue that is affecting my life, my local river, so on and so forth on the day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. One of the questions that we were really interested in finding out is the extent to which voters were willing to pony up to address sewage pollution in their local rivers. This is one of the reasons why you always kind of have to ask these questions with either a cost or a contrast or some sort of trade-off, as opposed to asking whether it's just straight up important for folks to have clean rivers. And we found that for the most part, voters in Massachusetts are perfectly willing to pay some amount of money to clean up local sewage pollution in the rivers, with most folks falling under the $100 per year levy. We find that, contrary to expectations, there are relatively few Scrooges in the state. They're only about 13% of the overall population. And there are some folks in here that would appear to be quite generous as far as the amount of money that they would be willing to personally pay in order to fund cleanup from sewage pollution in their local rivers. But that under $100 appears to be the sweet spot, and really it's under about $50 is $50 a year is what most people seem to be interested in. Next slide, please. We find that setting aside a special fund through a tax measure to mitigate flooding and climate impacted catastrophes is something that has a supermajority support in the state. There is a bit of sort of question priming where we're providing information for folks, excuse me, about what a local fund would do in order to protect local communities in Massachusetts from flooding and other natural disasters caused by climate change. Since we know that climate change is a particularly high salience issue as far as environmental issues are concerned, it's a reasonable assumption that people would be willing to support some sort of special fund to address these concerns. And we find that around 80% of voters are in favor of this measure. But what is of note is not so much the overall support, but again, it's the intensity. We see that more than half of the folks that support um, uh, 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 having this 1 cent, 1/4 of 1 cent income tax increase in order to provide for this special fund are people that only somewhat support it. Right. And you could very easily see that in sort of changing economic circumstances, if the economy took a significant hit, or if the cost of living issues continue to spiral out of control in the state, and not even in absolute terms, just sort of in relative terms compared to how they were last year, we would expect to see this viability for a potential tax measure decrease. We would also expect to see the overall support for this measure decrease if it were the subject of contrasting or negative attacks. But nevertheless, this is a good starting point for a special tax measure. Next slide, please. Sort of it's similar to what we had done with how significant of an issue is sewage pollution in your state rivers versus in your local rivers. We were asking people how they felt about either the state of Massachusetts being prepared for extreme weather events like hurricanes and flooding versus how people's local communities felt prepared for extreme weather events like hurricanes and flooding. What we did differently this time, though, was to split sample these questions, right? So half of the roughly 1,000 respondents got question 21, the how prepared do you believe that Massachusetts is for these extreme weather events? And the other half got question 22, the local. So they're not in direct conflict with each other. And generally what we see is that there's about the same level of perceived preparedness between the state and the local, right? So it's 69% of voters in Massachusetts feel that the state is either very prepared or somewhat prepared for extreme weather events, versus 74% that believe that local community or that the local community is either very prepared or somewhat prepared for some of these extreme weather events. That's about 5 points of difference. That's barely outside of the margin of error for statistical viability. But the sentiment, again, is just not very intense, right? This, to repeat myself, sort of indicates a lack of broad knowledge here. And in the event that either the state or local communities did not perform up to people's expectations in the event of a serious crisis, obviously the support, the belief and the confidence that folks have in this disaster preparedness would be pretty well shaken. Next slide, please. One of the things that we found consistent across our environmental polling is that improving infrastructure and infrastructure spending more broadly is a very high priority for folks, particularly in terms of it being a climate mitigation measure. So we asked this question of how much of a priority do you believe it is for the state to make infrastructure investments to better prepare Massachusetts for climate change driven extreme weather events like floods and hurricanes. And we asked our respondents to rank either as an essential priority, a high priority, somewhat of a priority, so essentially a secondary one, a low priority, or just flatly not a priority at all. Um, the share of folks that believe that it is an essential priority is quite high, given that this is, not something that specifically and directly addresses affordability, the most high salience issue, and is notably high in intensity among Black and Latino constituencies. And we don't really have a good explanation for why that might be the case. Similarly, we see that there is, essentially no notable opposition, right? The share of folks that say that this sort of infrastructure spending is just flatly not a priority is very small. It's in the high single digits at most. But the vast majority of respondents, if they had to pick any one of these answers, fall on it's a high priority range, right? So the plurality, some cases even a majority of our respondents among these subdemographics fall within those categories. Next slide, please. Um, this was more salient given that I think this survey had gone into the field maybe 3 or 4 weeks after Hurricane Melissa. So it had been in the news recently. But when we asked voters whether they were worried about something similar happening to Massachusetts in the next 5 to 10 years, we did see that there was something of an intense worry around those sorts of issues, particularly among Latino voters. And again, we don't have a ready explanation for why that might be. This is a subject that warrants further investigation and additional research. We also see in sort of environmental polling issues more specifically that the further out you get from the present moment, the more concerned people tend to be about climate change driven or climate related disasters, right? So there's this perception that climate is not necessarily impacting our day-to-day lives now, although of course we all know that it is, but that there is a near certainty that in the next 5, 10, and especially 20 years, that it is going to be impacting people then. Next slide, please. And within some of the local concerns, when we localize some of these concerns to specifically talk about how worried folks are about flooding in your community, we see again that worry drops off pretty significantly. Latinos again being the lone exception, but even then their intensity is not particularly strong in favor of being worried. We see a larger share of Latino respondents saying that they are somewhat worried compared to the other demographics, but it's just not particularly strong, again, as people become sort of more familiar with their specific locations, and just, either that or they don't believe that it can happen to them. It's one of those two explanations for the most part. We also tested a series of statements that were specifically meant to drive additional support for infrastructure spending to help mitigate against climate change-driven weather events. And very interestingly, one of the things that we found was that modernizing, a message that centered modernizing infrastructure to repair, upgrade and modernize aging bridges, roads, and flood control systems was by far the most appealing and convincing message of any that we tested. Um, it performed significantly better than a message that centered jobs and creating good paying jobs in Massachusetts. It performed much better than a message that specifically called out keeping folks in the state safe. And it even performed better than investing in infrastructure as a means of sort of addressing the cost of living crisis, particularly around further increases in property, flood, and renters insurance. Maybe that is specific to just insurance not being seen as a particularly key issue as far as affordability is concerned. But as Stefan and I were talking about before folks hopped on, we do see this very strong sense that people in this country do want their roads to be fixed, their potholes to be filled in, There are bridges to be fixed, and just all of this stuff that we very obviously see needing pretty dire repair. And at the moment, anyway, nothing really significantly happening to address those issues. Um, and the voters are saying somebody should do something about that. Next slide, please. So that pretty much wraps it up. We can get into some of the demographics, but as part of our overall next slide, please, Stefan. As part of our overall process for weighting the results of a survey, we are always going to get responses that are demographically out of whack with what the registered voter universe is for a particular state. And so we sort of weight the respondents accordingly in order to match the responses up to the demographic profiles of the state that we have. But at the same time, we want to be able to say that we have a statistically valid sample of Latino voters and Black voters, which is why we did an oversample for those two demographics in this state. And so we largely line these up with the respondents and the self-identification for folks in the state, or at least among registered voters anyway. Next slide, please. And we also broke this out among party ID. Unsurprisingly, there's lots and lots of Democrats. Income, which is the question that is always the hardest for us to wait on because people either don't know how much money they make in a given year or really like lying about how much money they make in a given year, and geography, which is a little bit easier for us to assess. And that's it. And I am now open for any questions. I have the crosstabs open, so if anybody has some specifics, I'd be more than happy to dive in.
Yes, if people are open to raising their hands, or you can also post questions in the chat and I can read them off the chat, but I'll also try to go in order of hands raised as well.
I'm happy to
Heather,
kick
why don't you
us off.
start?
Emily, was that you who said you wanted
Oh, yeah,
to
yeah.
start?
Heather,
You
I
should
didn't see
go
your
ahead.
hand.
You should.
No, you go first. You were very polite in putting your hand up first.
I was just following instructions. I have a question about, I'm going back to it, about the the question about the willingness to pay and how much you're willing to pay. I'm
Yeah,
wondering if there's a yeah, so that where it said that people are generally are willing to pay and kind of up to $100 a year. Was there a geographical breakdown to that question in the way that you had to for some of the others?
Yes, there was. So, Stefan, if you would pull that up, that's slide 11, and I can look that up for you real quick.
Now I'm trying to remember which one that was. There,
Yes,
yeah, here we go.
question 14.
And I
So
guess I'm
we
wondering, was there any difference in geographies, or is it just consistent statewide?
there is some difference in geography. It also depends on how you break these out, right? So if we're looking at Greater Boston, which is Suffolk, Norfolk, and Middlesex, at least in our definition anyway, you're talking about 67% of the respondents were willing to pay we're willing to pay up to about $100 a year. So that's roughly in line with what the state is as a whole.
Yeah.
If you're looking at the rest of the state, or sorry, the ones that were honestly most stingy were the folks in southern Massachusetts and on the coast. So that's Barnstable, Bristol, Dukes, Nantucket, and Plymouth. And you had about 18% of folks who were not willing to pay anything at all, and only about 66%, so still roughly in line with folks that were willing to pay about $100 a year. So to answer your
Okay.
question, there's not much difference, but it's that threshold that is really kind of the key thing, right? Either you're willing to pay up to $100 or you're not willing to pay anything at all, if you're sort of left to your own devices there.
Yeah, thank you.
Go next. So for those of us who are in the business of advocating for sewage-free rivers, upgrading infrastructure, protecting people from flooding, making these investments, but we're also competing for a lot of, for attention from our political leaders. It seems overall like this does reflect that, like it's our sense those of us on the advocacy side, that the people are with us. But sometimes we don't feel that because we don't see our issues being talked about and prioritized. And so to me, this does seem like the picture you've painted here of how people feel is good news for us in general. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I mean, look, this is the sort of like the classic advocate's dilemma, which is that you have this issue that is very, very important. And particularly around sewage pollution, is like, fairly significant, and to me anyway, attention grabbing issue to address that just the public as a whole is focused on other stuff, right? And it's not for lack of caring. It's just that times are tough right now and people are trying to keep body and soul together. And so you have to find a way to get attention and mobilize a broad public to push for the necessary changes to, address some of these key issues. I will tell you this much. I would much rather see this results than to see the opposite of what they could be, right? If you are talking about, um, trying to, if you were trying to be on the like we should build lots of data centers end of the business, which is pretty widely hated at this point, that's a whole different set of issues that you have to deal with there. It's just not very high salience, and that's true of a lot of folks that are in the advocacy space, right?
Thank you. And then I have one follow-up. I was trying to do a little psychoanalyzing on that infrastructure question because that was so interesting in terms of which messages worked. And I wondered if, like, when you think about, when you're given these choices, investing in infrastructure will keep us safe. Well, maybe that doesn't make someone feel good to think that I'm not safe or
Mhm.
that, it'll save you money. Well, then I'm reminded that I have no money. But
Yeah.
modernizing, who doesn't want to modernize? That seems cool. So I don't know if you have any like, because I mean, not that we don't talk about modernizing, but it's probably not something that many of us, it's probably not our first talking point about the need to make these investments. It probably is more about keeping you safe, saving money, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of thing where focus group research is really, really helpful because you can hear people talk, directly about what it is that, they are concerned about as far as the roads, bridges, tunnels, et cetera, right? Part of the problem with trying to do some psychoanalysis of this is that you can kind of convince yourself of anything if you think hard enough, right? But you could well imagine somebody driving over the same pothole that never gets fixed,
Mhm.
right? And certainly when I was still living in Oakland, this was like the experience of driving around the city was to try not to do $150 worth of damage to your car every time you went to go get groceries. And that could get pretty aggravating pretty quickly. It's the stuff that you see every day, like the tangible, as opposed to paying your bills, which can be a little bit more abstract, particularly when it comes to stuff like insurance.
Well, I'll keep going until someone else jumps in. It was very interesting, the different, even beyond the margin of error of white answers, Latino answers, Black answers. And it sounds like it might take some follow-up work to understand why, but do you have any speculation about that, either from this or any other polls that you've done, what that's related to? Like, is it more feeling more vulnerable? Um, I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's because certainly in Massachusetts, the Black and Latino communities tend to be more concentrated in very specific areas as opposed to the rest of the state, right? Um, yeah, so I live in Brooklyn right now, right? And it's a similar kind of issue as far as like the environmental concerns that you would see upstate tends to be very, very different from the kinds of things that people are perceiving, particularly if you live in like South Brooklyn or any other place that's right on the shore, right? They're about to get pummeled by a winter storm here in on Sunday, if I had to guess a guess, and it's constantly flooding, right? And I would imagine that for a lot of folks, that tends to make it a more kind of high intensity issue. And then for a variety of historical reasons, that also tends to be in the places that to have a lot of people of color living there. That's just my guess, but without any kind of further research, it's hard for me to say.
Tom, you can go next.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Ross. So I'm curious on this slide about the fact that you've asked the question in terms of modernizing infrastructure, um, and you include bridges, roads, etc., and we get 43%. But then when you take out the roads and bridges and you get down to just dealing with uh, the flood control issues, we drop down to 19%. So is it uh, accurate to assume that roughly half of those people who said 43, I'm interested in investing in infrastructure, are really interested in investing in transportation infrastructure and not flood control?
That we can't say, unfortunately, right? And that's not a yes or a no. That's just a we don't know because we don't have follow-up questions for this. Um, so I, doing polling on issues like affordability, cost of living, infrastructure spending is always really interesting because those words mean a lot of different things to people. And the meaning of those words will change depending upon where you are. That's why these sort of like big sample surveys um, that the Partnership Project and EPC funds are so valuable because they're large enough that we can see a lot of responses from different constituencies about that. If I had the opportunity to do this all over again and have this be, much more kind of like infrastructure specific in terms of this survey, that would very much be one of the questions that we would want to ask.
And one other question, obviously we're just getting this on a cursory view right now, but as I
Mhm.
go through this, I'm not seeing any significant variation from a demographic point of view, whether or not it's geographical and you're talking about the South Coast or the urban or Western Mass, whether you're talking about Black, Latino, or white, or even age. I'm not seeing any thing that's jumping out at me as how we should target our messaging. Is there anything that I'm missing that you saw that said, oh, this is who we should be targeting? Latino men in the 18 to 24 age category who live in Western Mass. Are you seeing anything in there? Because I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah, unfortunately, not that specific. So um, that is part of what makes uh, follow-up research like this really valuable, is that if you have a specific project that you're working on, you can ask more follow-up questions for folks who may have more kind of like local and situational awareness in a way that benefits particular political pushes, right? Like if you're talking about statewide issues, really what that shows you is how much salience any of these one issues have, but it doesn't provide a lot in the way of specific messaging for a specific campaign. That is a question of how do we integrate the local context that we're operating in um, to some of these findings that we see, right? Are we hearing out in the community that there is just a bunch of roads and bridges that are very obviously falling apart and need to be addressed? And is that something that we could maybe leverage at the State House into getting some significant infrastructure spending that also has, these other sort of like project priorities tacked onto it, right? That's not something that a survey like this can answer or is really necessarily designed to answer. Um, but instead, it's more to give a jumping off point for the kind of creative enterprising that advocates do, right? Um, so I hope that answers your question, and if not, I'm happy to do some additional follow-up on that.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Ross, something I think also could be helpful, going back to one of the very starting slides even, you noted a bit how the survey was conducted online with an opt-in web panel. I was curious if you could tell our viewers a little bit about how that works and also why that was the methodology chosen and what the benefit is in comparison to other kind of methodologies?
Yeah, so it's a lamentable fact, but the days of the golden days of survey work where you would call people on your landlines are dead and gone. When my soon-to-be father-in-law got rid of his landline, I think he was probably the last person in New Jersey to have one, and I knew the game was up at that point. Um, so in order to contact people for survey work in a traditional fashion where you're calling them on their phones, you're engaging them in a 12, 15, 18-minute long conversation, that can get pretty prohibitively expensive pretty quickly. We expect to call 200 people in order to get one person to respond. Uh, that's a lot of man hours at a calling house. That's a lot of investment that you need to put into it, and it's also very, very slow. But it is an effective way of getting and collecting data that is a very, very good snapshot in time. So one of the ways that we have for compensating that is to move a lot of this research online onto web panels that either we blast out to people in the form of text messages and then complement live phone calls to them. Or in the case of this opt-in web panel, we have vendors who have just these vast databases of people who have been given a survey that says, hey, uh, you seem like somebody who would be interested in taking surveys. Would you like to do this for fun and profit? And the answer is yes, a lot of the time. That's what the opt-in is. So folks are compensated for participating in surveys. They get asked a whole bunch of questions, not just about these sorts of issues, but really about anything, right? So it could be brand identification for like car dealerships. It can be but political, it can be, very sort of nonprofit specific, all kinds of stuff. And the trade-off is that you can do that fairly cheaply. I think this survey costs probably about a quarter of what it would normally cost for a traditional phone survey. You can ask a lot of people, so we talked to 1,000 folks, and you can target them more sort of uh, broadly with less difficulty than you would if you were trying to talk to them on the phone. Um, you are talking to people who love taking surveys for a living, which does make your results a little bit different. On the other hand, if you're talking to somebody in a traditional political survey, like on the phone, who is talking to you, who is talking to a perfect stranger on the phone for 18 minutes, that is also a little bit of a weirdo, and you have to take that with a grain of salt too.
Thank you, Ross. Do we have some other questions for Ross? One also that I think that could be helpful. I know we also have a lot of interest, as previously asked, about this cost to clean up sewage. I was curious if you could share any other details, or if there were any other details, breaking down information about the people who responded the way they did. If there was something about location revealing how much they're going to pay, income level, or political affiliation, anything along those sorts, just in terms of targeting our messaging.
Yeah, I think this was sort of in line with Heather's question from earlier. Geographically, there's not really that much of a difference. There is some greater resistance to uh, paying anything in some parts of the state, but it doesn't really impact folks that are at or under that $100 threshold. Not surprisingly, if you're a self-ID'd Republican or a self-ID'd conservative, you're less willing to part with your money than you would be if you are a Democrat or an independent, irrespective of your ideology, right? So there is some difference there. We see a little bit more opposition to spending among some of the older voters, but it's not outside of the margin of error. And let me just look at so the biggest sort of age difference that we see are the baby boomers are the only sort of age cohort that are um, have a statistically significant difference in terms of whether they would whether they are not willing to spend any money to clean up local sewage pollution, um, which probably is reflective of the fact that you got a lot of folks that are on fixed income that are in that demographic, and they may literally not be able to part with you know anything that's not already in their budget. But they're sitting at about 18%. But again, within that $100 threshold, there's essentially no difference everywhere across the state. And that to me is a green flag of, hey, there may be something here. Let's see if we can get some additional research going. Maybe this could inform an advocacy push at either the state level or the local level and see where we can go with this. Because if you have that kind of consistency across most of the key demographics in the state, that tells you something.
And I know in the earlier slide where it was 99% in support of clean rivers, based on this seems that it's in that case would be more accurate at 87%. Is that a fair takeaway based on the responses?
Yeah, I think that when the rubber meets the road with a lot of folks is whether you are going to charge anybody any money for it, right? It's nice to say, but how is this going to affect my bottom line is how a lot of people tend to think about this sort of stuff.
Does anyone have any more questions to share to pose for Ross or about any of these
Yeah,
very
actually, I have one that just
Oh, thank
came
you, Dave.
up.
Go ahead.
Ross, maybe it was in there and I missed it, but I was thinking if you ask, how important clean rivers are, and it's mentioned 99%. Was there a question in there, sort of both statewide and locally, how clean do you think your rivers are? To get a perception of what, people actually think about their rivers and
Yes.
just going to that so I understand, because that's where I wonder some of the opportunities, perception versus reality, as to the cleanliness of the rivers.
Yes. So that is this exact slide that we have here, where we contrasted how serious of a problem do you think sewage pollution is in Massachusetts versus how serious of a problem do you think sewage pollution is in your local rivers. And it's about a 14-point difference, but crucially, it's not really in terms of intensity, right? You're essentially moving folks from the bucket of, yeah, I think this might be a problem to the bucket of, I think this might not be a problem, right? There's not a lot of knowledge going on as far as it goes.
But if I could jump in there, it's still a majority think that there is some level of a problem,
Yes,
which
that's true.
we agree with.
Yeah, and I mean, it wouldn't take much, particularly if you have an especially dramatic example of sewage pollution seriously impacting a local river system to get people uh, feeling, outraged and motivated to do something about. Because again, there's no opposition here, right? Nobody is saying we can't clean up our rivers, we must not clean up our rivers. You're sort of pushing at an open door in that set of circumstances. It's just not a particularly high salience issue, but you can make it one, and that's what advocates do.
And we are in the process of that as
Yeah,
we speak.
yeah,
And
exactly.
that's been our experience, is that many people weren't aware that, speaking for the Charles, that the Charles still had raw or treated sewage going into it in every large rainstorm, and sometimes even a pretty small rainstorm. And that was a lot of the new people who weren't already in our universe saying, is this real? We still do this? So
Mhm.
yeah, so that's consistent with what you're finding here.
Just want to keep it open in case anyone has some more questions. You also can feel free to drop them in the chat if you're a little camera shy. Well, if it's the case and everybody feels sufficiently educated from tonight's poll responses, we can wrap things up a little bit early. And as I mentioned a little bit at the top, so this was a part of a training cohort where the participants, such as myself, were able to learn about how to draft different questions and then pose them as part of this poll that Hit Strategies and Ross were able to send out. So there, of course, is the aspect of, well, we have a bit of newbies asking the questions, but you also have basically an intro into it. So you are dipping your toe and you're getting a sense of what things are. But as Ross sort of mentioned, there are a lot of opportunities for follow-up as well to gain more information. So with that, I will wrap things up, but I thank all of you guys for joining here tonight and taking the time. And thank you to Ross for taking the time to educate us, and to our co-hosts again, our fellow Watershed groups. We appreciate you co-hosting tonight. And with that, I wish everybody a great night and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks,
So,
Stefan. Take
thanks,
care,
Ross.
folks.
That was awesome. Thanks, guys.